Hi, okay, so my name is Mr. Conklin. I'm a biochem major here, and today I'm going to be talking about an important part of college life, and that would be drinking. So, even though if, assuming I can apply the 20 responses I had to the class as a whole, assuming that the results are correct, 60% of us drink at least once a month. However, only about 20% of us have ever had the chance to actually see what the experience of making a drink from scratch is like. So I decided to talk about that today. About a year and a half ago, I took up homebrewing as a hobby of mine. And through my journey of discovering what works and what doesn't work and what causes a carboy to explode in your house, the three things that I've learned are probably the most important are preparation, the initial brew, and then the fermentation that follows it. And those three facets make up pretty much all of home brewing, encompassing even beer, excuse me, beer and winemaking, which are very different. However, in either case, you're going to need a carboy, which is this little glass jug here, an airlock, which is what sits on top of it, yeast, and food for the yeast. So preparation for the next part of the homebrewing process involves a lot of cleaning. So because yeast is a microorganism and the jug is on a very small scale, even tiny imbalances in the ecosystem can have drastic consequences and can completely ruin a batch. So you need to sanitize basically everything possible. If it's going to be touching the drink at all, it needs to be sanitized. You can do this using a bleach solution, or there are commercial products available that work as well. And again, just the absolute essentials are a carboy, an airlock, yeast, and a food supply. There's other things that can come in handy, such as a thermometer, a hygrometer, if you eventually want to start being able to accurately measure the proof of the alcohol that you've made. But for the basics, this is what you'll need. So now comes the initial brew, and this is the next important step. Because a lot of people think that beer, being the more blue-collared, being the more blue-collared sort of drink would be easier to make, but that's actually backward. The fact is that wine only uses natural sugars already occurring in the fruit that is used to make it, whereas the beer uses what is called a malt, which, sparing you the science mumbo-jumbo of it, is essentially adding additional products to the fermentation for the yeast to break down. So that's why beer ends up having a bitter taste when you put hops into it. Anything that you put in is going to have an impact on the final result. And so you always want to make sure that you know your recipe beforehand. And going off of knowing what you're going to use beforehand, a lesson that I learned is to always use whole spices. Because if you use anything powdered, like if you're using cinnamon, you need to use an actual cinnamon stick. Otherwise, it will form into a foam and it'll leak into the airlock. And when the airlock gets blocked and all the carbon dioxide builds up in the tiny chamber, which is now a pressure cooker, it blows up and your roommates will get really angry with you. So, based on a study that I found from Alba Louise and Sigal Kurisovia, the optimal temperature of the yeast while it is in the initial brew stage is around 66 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you need to err on one side or the other, err on cooler. If you get too hot, you can actually start killing off the yeast. And speaking of killing off the yeast, now we're getting to fermentation. And there are two parts to fermentation. There's what is called the primary, and that is about a week long, and that's when you see the very classic bubbles. If you've ever seen any kind of show like Moonshiners, I don't know if anyone watches that. But there's a lot of rapid bubbling, and that's when a large part of the natural sugars are quickly converted into ethanol, which is the alcohol. And after about a week, it'll settle down and it'll go into what is called secondary fermentation. And secondary takes between 2 and 3 weeks usually. There's exceptions, of course. But as that builds the alcohol content, eventually it'll get to the point where the yeast cannot survive in the amount of alcohol it's produced. For most yeasts, this is between 10% and 15% alcohol. And that's actually when you can tell that the fermentation is done, because the yeast will no longer be able to reproduce. And that's when bottling and aging can occur. So all in all, the total time of this will take about 1 month. So just in summary, for fermentation, should any of you be interested in getting into the hobby, first thing, preparation. Make sure that you have carboy, airlock, yeast, and then the food for the yeast, and sanitize everything. And next is the initial brew. You need to know what you're working with. Make sure you've read your recipe. Make sure you have everything on hand. And then the final is the fermentation, which is about 1 month in total, from the time the initial brew starts to the time that the yeast can no longer survive. So I hope I was able to interest you all in the hobby of home brewing. And if anyone has any more questions, then I'm happy to answer. But otherwise, I'm done.